The gunshot echoed across the vast Wyoming plain, spooking the two dappled Maras pulling Jessamine Caldwell's wagon just as she crested the ridge overlooking Promise Valley. At 6 months pregnant and traveling alone, she had no chance of controlling the suddenly frantic animals as they lurched forward, sending the wagon careening down the steep incline toward the valley below. It was May 1875, and Jessamine's carefully planned journey to reunite with her sister in Sweetwater was spiraling into disaster. The wagon bounced violently over rocks and scrub brush, each impact sending waves of pain through her swollen body. With one final, desperate attempt to regain control, she yanked hard on the reins, but the motion only threw her off balance. The next jarring bump launched her from the driver's seat into the air. The world spun around her as she instinctively wrapped her arms around her belly, bracing for impact. The fall seemed to take forever, yet happened in an instant. She landed with a thud on the sun-baked earth, the breath knocked from her lungs, her vision blurring at the edges as she watched her wagon continue its wild descent without her. "Hang on, madam." A deep voice cut through her daze as the thunder of hoofbeats approached. Through tear-filled eyes, Jessamine glimpsed a rider on a chestnut stallion racing down from a nearby ridge. The man expertly guided his horse alongside her runaway wagon, leapt from his saddle onto the driver's bench, and gradually brought the panicked Maras under control. By the time the stranger had secured her wagon and ridden back to where she lay, Jessamine had managed to push herself to a sitting position, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. "Don't move," he commanded, swinging down from his horse in one fluid motion. Dust swirled around his tall frame as his boots hit the ground. "You took quite a fall." Jessamine tried to speak, but only a dry cough emerged. Her rescuer knelt beside her, removing his hat to reveal sun-streaked golden-brown hair and concerned green eyes in a face weathered by years under the open sky. "My baby," she finally managed to whisper. "Please." "My baby." His expression softened immediately. "Let me help you. Name's Gideon Walsh." His hands were surprisingly gentle as they moved to support her back. "Can you tell me where you're hurting, madam?" "Everywhere," Jessamine admitted, then winced as a sharp pain lanced through her side. "But mostly here." She indicated her left ribs. Gideon's face grew serious. "That wagon's in no shape for you to be driving, and you're in no shape to be driving it." He studied her for a moment before adding, "My ranch is just over that ridge. I've got clean beds, and my housekeeper knows something about midwifery." When Jessamine hesitated, he added softly, "I know you don't know me from Adam, madam, but you and your little one need proper care." "I can't impose," she began, but another wave of pain cut her words short. Without further discussion, Gideon carefully slid one arm beneath her knees and the other around her shoulders. With remarkable gentleness for such a powerfully built man, he lifted her against his chest. As he cradled her, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection that made Jessamine's breath catch for reasons entirely unrelated to her fall. "You're mine now, if you'd like," he said softly, his voice deep and reassuring. "At least until you're well enough to continue your journey. I promise you'll be safe at Evergreen Ranch." Jessamine felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek as he carried her toward his horse. Perhaps it was the shock or the vulnerability of her situation, but in that moment, she felt an inexplicable sense of coming home in the arms of this stranger. "Thank you," she whispered, surrendering to the strength of his embrace as he carefully settled her on his horse before mounting behind her. With one arm securely around her waist, he clicked to his stallion. "Easy now, Atlas. Precious cargo." As they rode toward the horizon, Jessamine's last thought before exhaustion claimed her was that Gideon Walsh smelled of leather, pine, and something uniquely comforting she couldn't quite name. The journey to Evergreen Ranch was mercifully short, though each hoofbeat sent jolts of pain through Jessamine's battered body. She drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of Gideon's strong arm around her, his deep voice occasionally murmuring reassurances into her ear. "Just a bit further now," he promised as they crested a small hill. "You're doing fine." When Jessamine managed to focus her vision, she gasped softly. Nestled in a protected valley stood a sprawling ranch house built of golden logs with a wide, welcoming porch. Several outbuildings formed a horseshoe around a central yard, and beyond them, fenced pastures stretched toward distant mountains. It was larger and more established than she had expected. "Welcome to Evergreen," Gideon said, a note of pride in his voice. "Been building it up for 8 years now." As they approached, a woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. She was stout and gray-haired, with a weathered face that broke into concern the moment she spotted Jessamine. "Merciful heavens, Gideon. What have you found now?" she called, hurrying down the porch steps. "Mrs. Abernathy," Gideon called back. "Prepare a bed. The lady's had a fall from her wagon. She's with child." The woman's practical efficiency took over immediately. "Bring her straight to the blue room. I'll fetch my herbs and hot water." Gideon dismounted carefully, then lifted Jessamine from the saddle as though she weighed nothing. The sudden movement caused her to cry out involuntarily. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his green eyes darkening with concern. "We'll have you comfortable soon." Inside, the ranch house was surprisingly refined, polished wood floors, handcrafted furniture, and colorful woven rugs that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Gideon carried her up a short staircase and into a pleasant bedroom with blue floral wallpaper and crisp white linens on the bed. "Mrs. Abernathy will help you get settled," he said, lowering her gently onto the mattress. "I'll bring her things from the wagon and see to the repairs it needs." Jessamine caught his hand before he could withdraw. "My name is Jessamine," she said, suddenly needing him to know. "Jessamine Caldwell. And I can never repay your kindness today." A smile transformed his solemn face. "No repayment necessary, Miss Caldwell. Just rest now." After he left, Mrs. Abernathy bustled in with an air of cheerful competence. "Let's get you out of these dusty clothes, dear, and see what damage that fall did." The next hour passed in a blur of gentle examinations, warm compresses, and herbal teas. To Jessamine's immense relief, her baby seemed unharmed, moving vigorously within her as if protesting the day's excitement. Her own injuries proved to be painful, but not severe. Extensive bruising along her left side, a sprained wrist, and various scrapes and cuts. "You're fortunate indeed," Mrs. Abernathy pronounced as she wrapped Jessamine's wrist in a snug bandage. "A few inches different, and that fall could have been much worse. You'll need to rest completely for at least a week, preferably 2. "I can't possibly stay that long," Jessamine protested, though the mere thought of returning to her wagon made her wince. "My sister is expecting me in Sweetwater. Is there anyone who can be notified?" the older woman asked practically. "Someone who could come for you, perhaps?" Jessamine shook her head. "My sister Julia is all the family I have left, and she's expecting her own child any day now. That's why I was traveling to her. We planned to help each other." Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand. "Well then, you'll just have to rest here until you're fit to travel. Mr. Walsh won't hear of anything else, I'm sure." Before Jessamine could respond, there was a knock at the door. Gideon entered, carrying her small travel trunk. "I've brought your belongings," he said, setting the trunk down by the wardrobe. "How is our patient, Mrs. Abernathy?" "Fortunate," the housekeeper replied. "No damage to the child that I can detect, and her own injuries will heal with proper rest, which I've told her she needs plenty of." Gideon nodded, his expression serious. "Consider Evergreen your home for as long as necessary, Miss Caldwell." "Please call me Jessamine," she said, suddenly self-conscious in the borrowed nightgown Mrs. Abernathy had provided. "And while I'm deeply grateful, I can't impose for weeks. I need to reach my sister in Sweetwater." "Sweetwater is almost 3 days' journey from here," Gideon replied. "I can send word to your sister explaining what's happened, but you won't be making that trip anytime soon." His tone was gentle but unyielding. Jessamine recognized the futility of arguing, especially when her body ached with every slight movement. "I'll compose a letter," she conceded. "If you could ensure it reaches her." "I'll send one of my hands first thing tomorrow," Gideon promised.
"Now you should rest."
"Mrs. Abernathy's venison stew will be ready for supper, and I expect you to eat hearty. You're feeding too, after all." There was something so reassuring about his matter-of-fact concern that Jessamine felt tears welling in her eyes. She blinked them back hurriedly. "Thank you," she managed, "for everything." After they left, Jessamine sank back against the pillows, her hand moving to caress her rounded belly. "Well, little one," she whispered, "it seems we've found ourselves in quite a situation." The baby responded with a strong kick, as if in agreement. Despite her intention to stay awake and compose the letter to Julia, exhaustion soon pulled Jessamine into a deep sleep. She dreamed of strong arms carrying her, of green eyes filled with concern, and of a sense of safety she hadn't felt since before her husband Thomas had died, leaving her alone with an unborn child and uncertain future. She woke to golden afternoon light streaming through lace curtains and the delicious aroma of cooking food. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the day's events came rushing back, along with the aches in her battered body. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Abernathy's entrance with a tray. "Ah, you're awake. Good. I've brought some broth and biscuits to start with." Jessamine struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain in her ribs. "Easy now," the housekeeper cautioned, setting down the tray to help arrange pillows behind Jessamine's back. "You'll be stiff for several days yet." As Jessamine ate, Mrs. Abernathy bustled about the room, opening a window to let in the fresh spring air and unpacking Jessamine's few belongings from her trunk. "Is Mr. Walsh married?" Jessamine asked suddenly, then blushed at her own forwardness. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled knowingly.
"No, dear.
Never has been, though not for lack of opportunities. Half the eligible women in the county have set their caps for him, but he's married to this ranch, as he says." "He's built something impressive," Jessamine observed. "Started with nothing but his own 2 hands and determination," the housekeeper nodded. "Came west after the war with just his horse and saddle. Worked other men's ranches until he'd saved enough to claim this land. Now runs one of the finest spreads in the territory." The information added new dimensions to Jessamine's mental image of her rescuer. A self-made man, then. A veteran, perhaps close to 30 years old? His face bore the lines of someone who spent long days outdoors, but his eyes had a youthfulness that was at odds with his serious demeanor. "And you've been with him long?" Jessamine asked, sipping the rich broth.
5 years now.
"My husband was the foreman until pneumonia took him 2 winters back. Mr. Walsh insisted I stay on, gave me this position running the household." Her voice softened with evident affection. "He's a good man, Miss Caldwell. One of the best I've known." Jessamine nodded, digesting this along with her soup. Good men were rare enough in her experience. Her father had been one, and Thomas too, in his quiet way. But neither had possessed the commanding presence or capable strength that Gideon Walsh exuded so naturally. "He said something strange when he picked me up," Jessamine found herself confiding. "He said, 'You're mine now, if you'd like.'" "What do you suppose he meant by that?" Mrs. Abernathy chuckled. "That's just his way. He takes responsibility for things animals, people, land. If something or someone comes under his protection, he considers it his duty to care for them properly." She gathered up the empty soup bowl. "I wouldn't read more into it than that, dear." But as the days passed, Jessamine found herself doing exactly that, reading meaning into every interaction with Gideon Walsh. He visited her room briefly each morning and evening, always courteous, always concerned with her comfort and recovery. He brought wildflowers once, saying he thought they might brighten things up, and placed them awkwardly in a jar by her bedside. On her 4th day at Evergreen, Jessamine insisted on coming downstairs for dinner, despite Mrs. Abernathy's protests. "I'm healing well," she argued, "and I'm going stir-crazy in this room, lovely as it is. Please, just help me dress." When Gideon entered the dining room that evening to find Jessamine seated at the table, wearing one of her own dresses that Mrs. Abernathy had altered to accommodate her pregnancy, he stopped short. "Miss Caldwell," he said, recovering quickly, "it's good to see you up and about." Jessamine couldn't help noticing that he had changed his shirt and combed his hair, small gestures that suggested he had prepared for her presence at his table. "I received word from your sister today," he added, taking his seat at the head of the table while Mrs. Abernathy served a roast. "She's delivered a healthy son and is recovering well. She's relieved to know you're safe and agrees you should stay here until you're fully healed." Relief flooded through Jessamine. "Oh, thank goodness. A boy." She must be overjoyed. Then the latter part of his statement registered. "But I can't possibly impose on your hospitality indefinitely." Gideon's gaze was steady as he served her a portion of meat. "It's no imposition. The ranch is large, and your presence—" He paused, seemingly searching for the right words. "Your presence brings a certain brightness to Evergreen." The simple compliment warmed Jessamine more than it should have. She lowered her eyes to her plate, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of dining alone with this man who was still largely a stranger, yet who had become her protector and host. "Your wagon repairs are coming along," Gideon continued, clearly sensing her discomfort and changing the subject. "The axle needed replacing, but my foreman Jackson is handy with woodworking. Should be roadworthy within another week." "That's very kind," Jessamine replied. "I insist on paying for the repairs." Gideon waved away her offer. "Consider it neighborly assistance. We look out for each other in these parts." "Then I must find some way to earn my keep while I'm here," she insisted. "I won't be a charity case." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you have a talent for needlework. As it happens, I've got a pile of shirts that need mending, and she claims her eyes aren't what they used to be." Jessamine nodded, relieved to have a purpose. "I'd be happy to help with that." The conversation flowed more easily after that. Gideon told her about the ranch, the cattle operation, the horses he bred and trained, the challenges and rewards of life in Wyoming territory. Jessamine found herself responding with stories of her own childhood in Missouri, her brief marriage to Thomas, and their dream of starting fresh in the West. "Thomas took ill just 3 months after we were married," she explained, her hand automatically moving to her belly. "He lived long enough to know about the baby, at least. He was so happy about that." Gideon's expression was solemn. "I'm sorry for your loss. It takes courage to continue the journey you planned together, especially in your condition." "What choice did I have?" Jessamine shrugged, though the simple gesture sent a twinge through her still tender ribs. "Julia is the only family I have left. We always planned to raise our children together someday." "And now you will," Gideon said, his voice gentle, just with a slight delay. After dinner, they moved to the parlor, where a small fire warded off the evening chill. Jessamine settled into a comfortable armchair while Gideon lit a lamp and selected a book from a surprisingly well-stocked shelf. "Do you enjoy reading, Miss Caldwell?" he asked. "Very much," she replied, surprised by this evidence of cultural refinement in a frontier rancher. "And please, after sharing your home and table, I think you might call me Jessamine." He nodded, a slight smile playing about his lips. "Jessamine, then. And I'm Gideon to my friends." He held up the volume. "Have you read Mr. Dickens? This one's a particular favorite of mine." The next hour passed pleasantly as Gideon read aloud from David Copperfield, his deep voice bringing the characters to life. Jessamine found herself watching his face, as much as listening to the words, the way his expression changed subtly with each character, the occasional glance he cast her way to gauge her reaction. When Mrs. Abernathy appeared to suggest it was time for Jessamine to rest, Gideon closed the book reluctantly. Perhaps we could continue tomorrow evening, he suggested, rising to help Jessamine from her chair. His hand was warm and strong as it closed around hers, and Jessamine felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with her baby's movements. "I'd like that," she said softly. That night, lying in her comfortable bed, Jessamine faced an uncomfortable truth. She was developing feelings for Gideon Walsh. Feelings that were inappropriate given her circumstances, a pregnant widow, temporarily dependent on his charity, with plans to leave as soon as her health and Wagon permitted. "This is foolishness," she whispered to herself in the darkness. "He's simply being kind because that's his nature." But when she finally drifted to sleep, her dreams were filled with the sound of his voice reading Dickens and the gentle pressure of his hand holding hers. The next morning brought clear skies and a resolution. Jessamine would guard her heart more carefully. She would accept Gideon's hospitality gratefully, but remember that Evergreen was a temporary haven, not a potential home. Mrs. Abernathy helped her dress in her most practical gown and escorted her downstairs to the sunny kitchen. "Mr. Walsh is out with the herd today," the housekeeper explained, setting a bowl of porridge before Jessamine. "Spring calving is in full swing. He asked me to show you around the ranch when you felt up to it." After breakfast, with her arm linked through Mrs. Abernathy's for support, Jessamine took her first proper tour of Evergreen Ranch. The main house was even more impressive by daylight, a substantial two-story structure built with the clear intention of lasting generations. Beyond the house lay a complex of well-maintained outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, a cookhouse where they took their meals, stables, a blacksmith's forge, and several barns. Gideon designed most of it himself, Mrs. Abernathy explained proudly. Said if he was going to build a place, he wanted to do it right the first time. "It's remarkable," Jessamine admitted. "How many men does he employ?" 12 full-time hands, more during roundup and branding. Most have been with him for years. The housekeeper pointed toward a fenced corral where a young cowboy was working with a spirited black horse. "That's young Jamie. Came to us as an orphan boy of 14, sleeping in our barn. Gideon took him on, taught him everything about horses. Now he's the best trainer we have." As they walked, Jessamine began to understand what made Evergreen special. It wasn't just a ranch. It was a community Gideon had built through his own labor and vision. Every person they encountered greeted Mrs. Abernathy warmly and tipped their hats respectfully to Jessamine, clearly already informed of her presence and situation. They were returning to the house when Jessamine spotted her wagon in an open-sided shed. A burly man with gray-streaked hair was working on one of the wheels. "That's Jackson, our foreman," Mrs. Abernathy explained as they approached. "The best craftsman in 3 counties. The man straightened at their approach, wiping his hands on a rag. "Afternoon, ladies. You must be Miss Caldwell. Good to see you up and about." "Thank you for repairing my wagon," Jessamine said. "Mr. Walsh tells me you're doing fine work." Jackson's weathered face creased in a smile. "Happy to help, madam. Boss says you had quite a spill." "I was fortunate Mr. Walsh was nearby," Jessamine acknowledged. "Fortunate indeed," Jackson agreed. "Though I'd say he's the fortunate one, having such a pretty guest to brighten up the place." He winked at Mrs. Abernathy, who swatted his arm lightly. "Don't you go putting ideas in the young lady's head, Jackson Thompson," she scolded, though her tone was affectionate. "Come along, Jessamine. You've been on your feet long enough for one day." As they walked back toward the house, Jessamine reflected on Jackson's words. Was it possible that Gideon found her presence as brightening as she found his? The thought sent a dangerous thrill through her that she quickly suppressed. That evening, Gideon returned later than usual, his clothes dusty from a day in the saddle. He apologized for his appearance at dinner. "Spring calving waits for no man," he explained, serving Jessamine a portion of Mrs. Abernathy's chicken and dumplings. "We had 3 new arrivals today, all healthy. Mrs. Abernathy showed me around the ranch," Jessamine told him. "You've built something truly impressive here." A touch of color rose in his tanned cheeks. "It's been a labor of love. When I came west after Appomattox, I had nothing but nightmares and determination. Building Evergreen gave me purpose." It was the first time he'd mentioned his war experiences directly, and Jessamine sensed there were depths of pain behind the simple statement. "You were in the Union Army?" she asked gently.
He nodded.
"Pennsylvania 83rd. Fought from Antietam to the Wilderness. Lost my brother at Gettysburg." His jaw tightened. "After that, I couldn't go home to our family farm. Too many ghosts." Jessamine's hand moved instinctively across the table to cover his. "I'm sorry, Gideon." He looked down at their hands, then turned his palm upward to clasp her fingers briefly. "It was a lifetime ago. Evergreen is my home now." His green eyes met hers with unexpected warmth. "And a much pleasanter place with your company, Jessamine." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities, until Mrs. Abernathy bustled in with dessert, breaking the spell. Later, they resumed their reading in the parlor, but something had shifted. Gideon sat closer to her than the night before, and when he passed her a cup of tea, his fingers brushed hers deliberately. Jessamine knew she should maintain her distance, but found herself drawn to him like a moth to flame. When he paused in his reading to ask her opinion of a passage, she realized she'd been watching the movement of his lips rather than listening to the words. "I'm sorry," she admitted, blushing. "My mind wandered." His smile was understanding. "You're tired. We should continue another time." As he helped her rise from her chair, his hand lingered at her elbow. "Jessamine," he said quietly, "I'm glad you're here at Evergreen. Not the circumstances that brought you, of course, but—" He hesitated, then finished simply, "I'm glad." Before she could respond, he lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the barest brush of lips against skin, yet it sent warmth cascading through her entire body. "Good night," he said, releasing her hand. "Good night, Gideon," she managed to reply, though her voice seemed to come from far away. That night, Jessamine lay awake long into the small hours, her mind and heart in turmoil. She was a pregnant widow, still grieving in many ways for the husband she'd lost. She had plans, responsibilities, a sister waiting for her. Developing feelings for Gideon Walsh was not just impractical, it was potentially heartbreaking. And yet, the connection between them felt real and significant. His kindness went beyond mere courtesy or charity. The way he looked at her, spoke to her, touched her with such gentle care it awakened feelings she'd thought permanently dormant. "What am I to do?" she whispered to her unborn child. "Your father would want me to be happy, I know. But is this wise?" The baby kicked vigorously, as if in answer. The next morning, Jessamine woke with renewed determination. She would neither encourage nor discourage whatever was developing between her and Gideon. She would simply allow each day to unfold naturally, making no decisions until she was physically recovered and thinking clearly. But fate had other plans. Shortly after breakfast, Gideon appeared at the kitchen door, where Jessamine was helping Mrs. Abernathy prepare preserves. "I need to ride into town for supplies," he announced. "Would you care to join me, Jessamine? The fresh air would do good, and you mentioned needing fabric for baby clothes." Mrs. Abernathy raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I'd love to," Jessamine replied before she could reconsider. After nearly a week at the ranch, the prospect of a change of scenery was appealing, regardless of the company. An hour later, she found herself seated beside Gideon in a small buggy, a light blanket tucked around her legs despite the mild spring day. Her bruises had faded to yellowish patches, and though her ribs still ached when she moved too quickly, she felt almost normal again. "Promise Valley is small," Gideon explained as they followed a well-worn trail through rolling grasslands, "but it serves our needs. General store, blacksmith, saloon, small hotel. We're getting a proper church built this summer." Jessamine enjoyed the journey immensely. Gideon pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the region's settlement. When they crested a hill and he showed her a herd of pronghorn antelope in the distance, their faces were so close that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. Promise Valley proved to be exactly as Gideon had described, a single dusty street lined with modest wooden buildings, the newest of which was clearly the church under construction at the far end. Main Street, Gideon announced with a touch of irony as he helped her down from the buggy. Also our only street. They drew curious glances as he escorted her into Henderson's general store, his hand supportively at her elbow. A bell jingled as they entered, and a tall, thin man with spectacles looked up from behind the counter. Gideon Walsh. Twice in 1 month we're honored, he called out cheerfully, then his eyes widened at the sight of Jessamine. And, with a lady friend. Herbert, Gideon nodded. This is Miss Jessamine Caldwell. She's staying at Evergreen while recovering from an accident. Miss Caldwell, Herbert Henderson, proprietor of our finest and only general store. Herbert came around the counter, wiping his hands on his apron before offering one to Jessamine. A pleasure, Miss Caldwell. Any friend of Gideon's is welcome in Promise Valley. Thank you, Jessamine replied, aware of how the shopkeeper's eyes had assessed her pregnant condition and Gideon's protective stance beside her. She could practically see the wheels of speculation turning. Miss Caldwell needs fabric for sewing, Gideon explained. And I've got my usual list of supplies. We'll browse a bit. Of course, of course. Fabrics are along the back wall. Just holler if you need anything. As they moved through the store, Jessamine became increasingly aware of the stir their presence was creating. 2 women who entered shortly after them huddled by the pickle barrel, whispering and casting glances in their direction. I believe we're causing a scandal, she murmured to Gideon as she examined a bolt of soft flannel. His mouth quirked in amusement. Small towns run on gossip. By supper time, we'll be engaged. By tomorrow morning, you'll have either bewitched me or I'll have kidnapped you, depending on who's telling the tale. Jessamine laughed despite herself. And you don't mind? His expression grew serious. I mind only if it distresses you. My reputation can withstand a little speculation. And mine is safe with me, he promised, his voice low and sincere. They completed their shopping, Gideon insisting on paying for the fabric despite Jessamine's protests. As they were preparing to leave, the door opened to admit a fashionably dressed woman with elaborately coiffed blonde hair. She stopped short at the sight of them. Gideon, what a delightful surprise, she exclaimed, her voice honey-sweet but her blue eyes sharp as they assessed Jessamine. Miss Harrington, Gideon replied, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been with Herbert. Good day to you. Won't you introduce me to your friend? The slight pause before the last word carried unmistakable insinuation. Gideon's jaw tightened, but his manners prevailed. Miss Georgina Harrington, may I present Miss Jessamine Caldwell? Miss Caldwell is a guest at Evergreen while recovering from an accident on her journey to Sweetwater. Georgina extended a gloved hand. How fortunate for you that Gideon found you. He has such a tender heart for strays. Jessamine felt heat rise in her cheeks at the deliberate insult, but before she could respond, Gideon stepped slightly forward. Miss Caldwell is a lady of refinement and courage, traveling alone to assist her sister after the death of her husband, he said, his voice quiet but carrying a warning edge. She deserves our community's respect and kindness, not idle speculation. Georgina's perfect smile faltered. Of course. I meant no offense. She turned to Jessamine with manufactured sincerity. Please accept my sympathy for your loss, Miss Caldwell. And do enjoy your stay in our little community. Thank you, Jessamine replied with equal insincerity. Everyone has been most welcoming. Outside, as Gideon helped her back into the buggy, Jessamine couldn't resist asking, an admirer of yours, I take it? Gideon snorted. An admirer of Evergreen Ranch, more likely. Georgina's father owns the bank. She's been making her interest clear since she returned from finishing school in Denver last year. She's very beautiful, Jessamine observed neutrally. Gideon glanced at her as he took his seat and gathered the reins. Beauty without kindness holds little appeal for me. The simple statement warmed Jessamine far more than it should have. On the return journey, they stopped by a small creek for a light picnic Mrs. Abernathy had packed. Gideon spread a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree and helped Jessamine settle comfortably before unpacking bread, cheese, cold chicken, and apple tarts. "I'm sorry about Georgina," he said as they ate. "Small towns can be judgmental places." Jessamine shrugged.
Eve fest vers.
After Thomas died, there were those in our town who suggested I'd somehow contributed to his illness, that the shock of my pregnancy had weakened his constitution. She smiled sadly. People find it easier to assign blame than to accept that misfortune can strike anyone. Gideon's expression darkened. "That's unconscionable. You were a wife grieving your husband while carrying his child. As I said, I've faced worse." Jessamine touched his arm lightly. "Your defense of me was gallant, if unnecessary. I've developed a thicker skin over these past months." "It shouldn't be necessary for you to have a thick skin," he said, covering her hand with his own. "You deserve kindness, Jessamine."
Care.
Protection. The intensity in his green eyes made her breath catch. They were sitting very close now, his face just inches from hers. "Gideon," she began, uncertain what she even wanted to say. He raised his free hand to gently brush a strand of hair from her cheek. "I know this is sudden. I know you're still healing in body and heart. I know you have plans that don't include a Wyoming rancher." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "But I can't deny what I feel when I'm with you." Jessamine's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "And what do you feel?" "Like I found something I didn't even know I was missing." His gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. "May I kiss you, Jessamine?" She should say no. She should remind him of all the reasons this was unwise, impractical, potentially heartbreaking for them both. Instead, she heard herself whisper, "Yes." Gideon's lips were warm and gentle as they met hers, the kiss tentative at first, then deepening as she responded. His hand cradled her face with infinite care, as if she were made of the most delicate porcelain. When they finally parted, Jessamine felt breathless in a way that had nothing to do with her healing ribs. "I didn't plan for this," Gideon said softly, his forehead resting against hers. "When I saw you fall from that wagon, I thought only of helping a woman in distress. I never imagined." "Nor did I," Jessamine admitted. "I was focused solely on reaching Julia, on preparing for this baby." Gideon's hand moved to rest lightly on her rounded belly. "Your child will always be a part of you, a testament to your love for Thomas. I would never try to replace him in your heart or in your baby's life." His understanding brought tears to Jessamine's eyes. "It's been so long since anyone cared for me," she whispered. "Since I allowed anyone to care." "I more than care, Jessamine," Gideon said, his voice husky with emotion. "I know it's fast, perhaps even foolish, but I'm falling in love with you. Your strength, your grace, your gentle heart. Everything about you calls to something in me I thought long buried." A tear slipped down Jessamine's cheek. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of opening my heart again. Afraid of disrupting the plans I've made. Afraid that what we're feeling is just circumstance, your natural protectiveness, my vulnerability." Gideon brushed away her tear with his thumb. "Those are all valid fears. I'm not asking for promises. Just openness. To see where this might lead, if we give it a chance to grow." Jessamine thought of Thomas, his kind face, his steady love, the dreams they'd shared. Would he want her to spend her life alone, clinging to his memory? Or would he want her to find happiness again, to provide their child with a loving home and family? "I think," she said slowly, that I would like to be open to possibilities. Gideon's smile was radiant. He kissed her once more, briefly but tenderly, before helping her gather up their picnic things. As they continued their journey back to Evergreen, Jessamine felt both terrified and exhilarated. She had no idea what the future might hold, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to imagine happiness beyond mere survival. The next week passed in a golden haze for Jessamine. Her body continued to heal, and with each passing day, her feelings for Gideon deepened. They established a comfortable routine breakfast together before he rode out to work the ranch, afternoons spent with Jessamine helping Mrs. Abernathy or working on baby clothes from the fabric Gideon had bought, evenings of reading aloud or simply talking by the fire. Gideon was attentive without being overwhelming, respectful of her independence, while making it clear he cherished their growing closeness. He spoke openly of his hopes for Evergreen's future, increasingly including Jessamine in those visions in subtle ways. The east bedroom would make a fine nursery, he mentioned casually one evening as they walked through the house. It gets good morning light, and it's close enough to the master suite to hear a baby's cries. Jessamine felt her heart flutter at the implication, but she was careful not to rush ahead of reality. Her wagon was nearly repaired, and Julia would be expecting her in Sweetwater. The letters they'd exchanged made it clear her sister still needed her help with the new baby. Yet each day, the thought of leaving Evergreen and Gideon became more painful to contemplate. "You're conflicted," Mrs. Abernathy observed one afternoon as she helped Jessamine fold baby gowns they'd sewn. "It's written all over your face, child." Jessamine sighed. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone with eyes in her head," the housekeeper replied kindly. "You care for him." "More than care," Jessamine admitted. "But my sister needs me. We've planned for months to raise our children together, to support each other as widows." Mrs. Abernathy's weathered hands stilled on a tiny gown. "Plans change, dear. Life has a way of presenting us with unexpected paths." "But is it fair to Julia? To suddenly change everything because I've met a man?" "Only you can answer that." The older woman patted Jessamine's hand. "But consider this, would your sister want you to sacrifice a chance at happiness out of obligation? And is Sweetwater the only place you can help each other?" The questions lingered in Jessamine's mind that evening as she and Gideon sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head leaned against him in a posture that had become familiar and precious. "Penny for your thoughts," Gideon said, noticing her pensive mood. Jessamine took a deep breath. "I was thinking about Julia, about my plans to join her in Sweetwater." She felt him tense slightly, though his voice remained casual. "Jackson says your wagon will be ready by week's end." "Yes," he told me. She turned to look at him directly. "Gideon, I made a promise to my sister. I can't simply abandon her." His green eyes were serious in the fading light. "I would never ask you to break a promise, Jessamine. Family is sacred." "But," she prompted, sensing there was more. "But I've been thinking," he said, taking her hand in his. "Sweetwater is only 3 days' journey. Not so far that sisters couldn't visit regularly. Not so far that a woman couldn't make a home in one place while maintaining close ties to family in another." Hope flickered in Jessamine's chest. "What are you suggesting?" Gideon shifted to face her more directly. "I'm suggesting that you continue to Sweetwater as planned. Help your sister through these first weeks with her new son. Get to know your nephew." He squeezed her hand gently. "And then, if your heart leads you back to Evergreen to me, the door will be open." "You'd wait?" Jessamine whispered. "For as long as necessary." His voice was firm with certainty. "What I feel for you isn't fleeting, Jessamine. It won't fade with a few weeks' separation." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't deserve such understanding." Gideon lifted her hand to his lips. "You deserve that and more. I want you to choose Evergreen, choose me freely, without regret or reservation." That means honoring your commitment to Julia first. In that moment, Jessamine knew with absolute clarity that she loved this man not just for his kindness or strength, but for his deep understanding of what mattered to her. "I will go to Sweetwater," she said softly. "I will help Julia, as I promised." And then she reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "And then I will return to you, Gideon Walsh. If you'll still have me." His kiss was answer enough, tender yet passionate, filled with promise and longing. When they finally parted, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I should speak with Julia," Jessamine murmured. "Explain everything." "We could ride to Sweetwater together," Gideon suggested. "I'd feel better knowing you arrived safely, and I'd like to meet the sister who means so much to you." The idea of introducing Gideon to Julia filled Jessamine with unexpected joy. "She'll adore you," she predicted. "Though she may scold me for finding a husband before I even reached her doorstep." "Husband," Gideon repeated, his voice catching on the word. Jessamine blushed, realizing what she'd inadvertently revealed. "I only meant—" "No," he interrupted, taking both her hands in his. "Don't take it back. Jessamine, I've been carrying something with me for days, waiting for the right moment." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that glinted in the last rays of sunset, a ring of delicately worked gold with a modest pearl at its center. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice suddenly husky with emotion. "I've kept it all these years, even when I thought I'd never have use for it." Jessamine's heart seemed to stop, then race forward at double speed. "I know this is fast," Gideon continued. "I know we have practical matters to resolve, your time with Julia, preparations for your baby, the logistics of building a life together. But I also know, with more certainty than I've felt about anything since claiming this land, that you are the woman I want to share Evergreen with, to build a family with, to love for all the days I'm granted on this earth." He slid from the swing to kneel before her, still holding her hands. "Jessamine Caldwell, will you marry me? Not today or tomorrow, but when you're ready, when you've fulfilled your promise to your sister and feel certain in your heart that this is where you belong." Tears flowed freely down Jessamine's cheeks. All her carefully constructed plans, all her fears and reservations, seemed to fall away in the face of this man's steady love. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Gideon Walsh. I will marry you." His hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if made for her. "When I said, 'You're mine now, if you'd like,' that day by the wagon," he confessed, "some part of me already knew. Even then, covered in dust with your face bruised and frightened, you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Not just in appearance, but in spirit." Jessamine caressed his face, overwhelmed by emotion. "And I think some part of me knew too, even through the pain and fear. I felt safe with you in a way I hadn't felt since losing Thomas." Their kiss sealed the promise between them, a promise of partnership, of family, of a future neither had expected, but both now embraced wholeheartedly. The journey to Sweetwater 3 days later was far different from the solitary, anxious travel Jessamine had experienced before her accident. With Gideon driving her repaired wagon and 2 ranch hands accompanying them as escorts, she felt protected and cherished. They arrived at Julia's modest home on the outskirts of Sweetwater in the late afternoon. Jessamine's heart pounded with nervous excitement as she saw her sister emerge onto the porch, a bundled infant in her arms. "Jessie," Julia called out, her face lighting with joy. "Oh, thank heavens you've arrived safely." Gideon helped Jessamine down from the wagon with careful hands, mindful of her still tender ribs and advancing pregnancy. As Julia rushed forward to embrace her sister, her eyes widened at the sight of the tall rancher. Introductions were made, explanations given, and by supper time, Julia was studying Gideon with approving eyes over her dining table. "Well," she declared after hearing their story, When I encouraged you to make this journey west, I hardly expected you'd find a husband before you even reached me. Julia. Jessamine protested, blushing. It's true, though, her sister continued, adjusting baby Daniel in her arms. And I must say, Mr. Walsh, you've won my gratitude for rescuing my headstrong sister. She never did have proper sense about traveling alone. Gideon smiled, his hand finding Jessamine's under the table. I'm the fortunate one, he said simply. Later, when the men had retired to tend the horses and Julia's baby was sleeping, the sisters spoke privately in Julia's small parlor. Are you certain, Jessie? Julia asked, her expression serious. It's happened so quickly. More certain than I've been about anything since Thomas died, Jessamine replied. Gideon is extraordinary, kind, honorable, strong. She touched her sister's hand. But I won't abandon you, Julia. I promise to help with Daniel, and I will. I can stay a month, even 2 if you need me. Julia's eyes softened. Oh, Jessie. I've seen how he looks at you like you're water in the desert, and how you look at him like you've found home. She squeezed Jessamine's fingers. I won't keep you from that happiness. A week to rest and get acquainted with your nephew will be enough. Then you should return to Evergreen with that fine man of yours. Tears of gratitude filled Jessamine's eyes. Are you sure? What about our plans to raise our children together? Plans change, Julia said pragmatically. Sweetwater is not so far from Promise Valley. We'll visit often. Our children will know each other as cousins should. Her smile turned mischievous. Besides, that ranch of his sounds like a far better place to raise children than my little house in town. Relief and joy washed through Jessamine. I love you, Julia. And I love you. Her sister leaned forward to embrace her. Enough to want your happiness above all else. Thomas would want this for you too, you know. He wouldn't want you to cling to grief when love is offering you a second chance. Jessamine nodded, feeling the truth of those words in her heart. Thomas had been her first love, the father of her child, a cherished chapter in her life story. But Gideon was her future, unexpected and wonderful. The week in Sweetwater passed quickly. Jessamine fell in love with her tiny nephew, helped Julia establish routines with the baby, and enjoyed watching Gideon charm her sister with his steady reliability and quiet humor. On their final evening before departing for Evergreen, as they sat together on Julia's porch watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass, Gideon asked Jessamine a question. When would you like to be married? She considered for a moment. Before the baby comes, she decided. I'd like our child to be born into our family with your name. Gideon's expression softened with emotion. I'd be honored to give my name to your child, Jessamine. To raise him or her as my own. I know you would, she said, leaning against his shoulder. That's one of the countless reasons I love you. 1 month, then, he suggested. Time to prepare properly, send word to a few friends I'd like present, arrange for the minister. 1 month, Jessamine agreed. At Evergreen, with the mountains as our witnesses. The return journey to Promise Valley seemed to fly by, filled with planning and dreams for their future. When Evergreen Ranch came into view, Jessamine felt a surge of emotion. This beautiful place was to be her home, the birthplace of her child, the foundation of her new life with Gideon. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the small community. To Jessamine's surprise, even Georgina Harrington eventually offered stilted congratulations when they encountered her in town, though the blonde woman's eyes still flashed with jealousy. Some people will talk, Gideon warned as they drove home from that encounter. They'll say it's too soon after your husband's passing, or question your motives because of the baby. Jessamine squeezed his hand. Let them talk. We know the truth of what we've found together. The wedding was everything Jessamine could have wished for, simple but meaningful, held on Evergreen's wide front porch with the Bighorn Mountains as a majestic backdrop. Julia came with baby Daniel, of course. Several neighboring ranchers and their wives attended, along with all of Gideon's ranch hands and Mrs. Abernathy, who wept openly throughout the ceremony. Jessamine wore a new dress of soft blue silk that complemented her 8 months pregnant figure rather than trying to disguise it. Gideon looked dashingly handsome in a new black suit, his normally untamed hair slicked back for the occasion, his green eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. "I take you, Jessamine, as my wife," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly to all assembled. "To cherish and protect, to honor and respect, to build a life and family with until death parts us." "I take you, Gideon, as my husband," she responded, her heart so full it seemed it might burst. "To love and support, to stand beside through all life brings, to create a home and family with until death parts us." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Gideon's kiss was tender but unabashed, a public declaration of his love and commitment that left Jessamine breathless and blushing. The celebration afterward was joyful, with music and dancing, though Jessamine participated only briefly, mindful of her condition. Abundant food prepared by Mrs. Abernathy and several neighboring wives, and enough good wishes to last a lifetime. As evening fell, and the guests began to depart, Gideon led Jessamine to a quiet corner of the porch. "I have something to show you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. He guided her upstairs to the east bedroom they had discussed weeks earlier. When he opened the door, Jessamine gasped in delight. The room had been transformed into a perfect nursery, walls freshly painted a soft yellow, a handcrafted wooden cradle in the corner, a rocking chair by the window, and a beautiful handmade quilt folded over the cradle's edge. "Gideon," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "When did you do all this?" "While you were in Sweetwater," he admitted. "I wanted it to be a surprise." Jackson made the cradle, and the ladies from neighboring ranches contributed to the quilt. Mrs. Abernathy supervised it all. Jessamine moved to the cradle, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful." "Perfect." Gideon came to stand behind her, his arms encircling her, hands resting on her rounded belly. "I want our child to know from the first breath that they are loved and wanted, that this home is theirs as much as ours." Jessamine leaned back against his solid chest, overwhelmed by the love she felt for this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly. "Our child will know that," she promised. "Every day." Just 2 weeks after the wedding, Jessamine went into labor during a gentle spring rain that promised good fortune for the growing season. Mrs. Abernathy took charge immediately, sending for the midwife from town while Gideon paced anxiously downstairs, banished from the birthing room but refusing to leave the house despite ranch work awaiting him. After 8 hours of labor, easier than most first births, the midwife declared approvingly Jessamine gave birth to a healthy daughter with a shock of dark hair and eyes that already hinted at the same green as Gideon's. When he was finally allowed to enter the bedroom, Gideon approached the bed with reverent steps, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Jessamine's arms. "You have a daughter," Jessamine said softly, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. Gideon sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his expression a mixture of awe and tenderness as he gazed at the infant. "She's perfect," he whispered, "just like her mother." "Would you like to hold her?" Jessamine asked. The look of momentary panic that crossed his face was endearing. "I've never held a baby before. What if I do it wrong?" "You won't," she assured him. "Just support her head." "Yes, like that." As Gideon cradled his new daughter, his large hands incredibly gentle with her tiny form, tears filled his eyes. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your pa." The simple declaration, spoken with such love and certainty, made Jessamine's heart overflow with emotion. This man, who had no biological connection to her child, had already embraced fatherhood with his whole heart. "What shall we name her?" Gideon asked, looking up at Jessamine. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on final choices. Now, looking at her daughter's delicate features, Jessamine knew.
Hope, she said.
Hope Elizabeth Walsh. Because she represents everything we hope for in our future together. Gideon's smile was radiant. Hope, he repeated, looking down at the baby. It's perfect. That night, with little Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle beside their bed, Gideon held Jessamine close. When I saw you fall from that wagon, he murmured against her hair, I had no idea I was witnessing the beginning of my greatest blessing. Jessamine turned in his arms to face him. And when you carried me and said, you're mine now, if you'd like, I never dreamed how completely I would come to want that. His kiss was gentle, mindful of her exhaustion, but filled with promise and devotion. Rest now, my love. Our journey is just beginning. As Jessamine drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, with their daughter breathing softly nearby, she marveled at life's unexpected turns. A frightening accident had led to the greatest happiness she could imagine: a loving husband, a beautiful child, a home where she belonged completely. Thank you, she whispered, partly to Gideon and partly to whatever divine providence had guided their paths to cross on that Wyoming plain. His arms tightened around her in response, a wordless promise of protection and love that would last a lifetime. 5 years later, Jessamine stood on the porch of Evergreen Ranch, watching as Gideon led 5-year-old Hope on her new pony, his patience infinite as he taught her to hold the reins properly. Their 3-year-old son Thomas toddled nearby, supervised by Mrs. Abernathy, who refused all suggestions of retirement despite her advancing years. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. Jessamine had brought her own talents to Evergreen ahead for figures that had improved their record-keeping and business dealings, a gift for hospitality that had strengthened community ties, and most importantly, the love that had transformed a well-built house into a true home. Julia visited regularly with Daniel and her second son, born 2 years after Hope. The cousins had formed a tight bond despite the distance between their homes, and the sisters' dream of raising their children together had been realized, if in a different form than originally planned. As Jessamine watched her family, one hand resting on her belly where a third child had just begun to make its presence known, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From grief and uncertainty to joy and security. From a frightening fall from a wagon to the strong foundation of love she now stood upon. Gideon looked up and caught her watching them. Even after 5 years of marriage, his smile still made her heart race. He lifted Hope from the pony and set her on her feet, then walked toward the porch, his long strides eating up the distance between them. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Walsh, he said, climbing the steps to stand before her. I was just thinking how fortunate that fall turned out to be, she replied, reaching up to touch his face. How differently things might have gone if you hadn't been riding by at exactly that moment. Gideon's arms encircled her waist, drawing her close. I've always believed some things are meant to be, Jessamine. You, me, our family, we were written in the stars long before we met. Such poetry from a practical rancher, she teased gently. You inspire poetry, he murmured, bending to kiss her. Their lips had barely touched when Hope's voice interrupted them.
Papa. Mama.
Look what I found. They turned to see their daughter running toward them, something clutched in her small hands, her face alight with the excitement of discovery. Duty calls, Gideon chuckled. Jessamine smiled, linking her fingers with his as they turned to receive their daughter's treasure. This was the life she had never expected but now couldn't imagine living without, rich with love, secure in belonging, blessed beyond measure. And it had all begun with a fall from a wagon and the strong arms of a cowboy who had carried her home.